Good evening, Praise Chapel Fresno, and all you tuning in, whatever you're tuning in on, wherever you're tuning in at. We just appreciate that you guys have showed up tonight, that you've logged in. We see our numbers kind of explode about 3 to 5 minutes after we start. So those of you that jump on early, really appreciate it. Love you guys. Love to see you guys here on Sunday. Still only live casting on Wednesday nights. Getting a good feel for what's going on in the community, you know, listening to CDC recommendations on basically a daily basis, and kind of just following through to make sure that we're in compliance with all regulations, recommendations, which we are at this point. Quick announcement, though. For the overflow room that we do have available, unfortunately, we're going to have to tear that down. We're in an in-construction phase right now where we're talking about our Sunday school, how we're going to bring our Sunday school back into play while there are still some children that may be at home that their parents may not feel comfortable coming in and still want to hold the Zoom. So we're in that process of organizing, and we got to do some construction in that room. So we are going to have to tear it apart. So we won't have the overflow room available anymore. But if you are coming to church and you want to continue to social distance, you don't feel comfortable around so many people, let us know. We'll make arrangements for you. We'll remove chairs if we have to. We'll do what we have to make everyone that wants to show up to church feel safe and secure as to what's going on. We still are in person on Sundays, live casting as always, always continuing to see what we can do to better our live casting situation. But so the overflow room will no longer be available on Sundays, on Wednesdays. That's going to be more, we're in a construction phase with our Sunday school, bringing them back, getting them still arranged and figure out what we're doing. So we're in discussions with the department heads of that to make sure that it's everything that they need. So it's going to take a bit that we got to tear it apart, put it back together, and get ready for our kids to come back to Sunday school. They're going back to school. Masks still required. We're probably still going to do that with our children. We're working all that out. We'll let you know the details, and we'll also be posting it on our social media as well as our website. Make sure you continue to share, like, bookmark, and comment on our statuses. That's basically how we're spreading throughout social media, is by your guys' contact of sharing, of liking, of bookmarking, and of commenting on our posts. So comments are real important, as is the bookmark. So I want to make sure that, you know, it doesn't take much to comment. Just throw something up there, even if it's hands raised, fire, whatever it may be, and make sure you share it. That's just basically how we're doing this at this time until we can get back in person of our outreaching, our in-reaching, whatever we may be doing. So just continue to follow us on social media. You can continue to give and support this ministry. You can do that via EasyTithe in your smartphone app. You can also go to easytithe.com and search Praise Chapel Fresno, and it'll show you the church that you can give to. Or you can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click the menu in the upper right-hand corner, go down till you see Give, and it'll take you to a safe and secure website where you can continue to financially contribute. Or you can drop off, mail in your tithes, your offerings at our physical address of our building. If you don't know what that is, Google Praise Chapel Fresno, California, and it'll show you our physical address. If you're showing up to our in-person, you can drop them off in our tithes and offerings collection boxes. We are not doing our offering baskets that we pass. We're trying to limit it person-to-person contact, still in that phase. So offering envelopes are available. And then on the outside of our sanctuary, we do have a place for you to drop off tithes, your offerings, which is safe, secured, and it's emptied out every Sunday to make sure that it gets deposited in a timely manner. But we appreciate you guys tuning in. We're still in our letters from Paul. So as we kind of wrapped up Colossians, God kind of throws Philippians on my heart, and it just has a lot to do with joy. And I feel at this point in time in our lives, a lot of times we find it really hard to find joy in the mundane things we do on a day-to-day basis. It's really difficult to find that. And I think throughout the entire book of Philippians, Paul really begins to underline how we can find our joy doing the mundane things, the day-to-day operations. And Paul kind of will mention that throughout the book of Philippians, that life can become so routine that we don't find the joy in the things that we once did anymore. So he brings it up. But we know the book of Philippians conveys a powerful message about the secret of contentment. So Paul doesn't say that you have to find joy in every situation. He says being content brings the joy. Although Paul faced several hardships, poverty, beatings, illness, and even his current imprisonment, you want to be an evangelist, you want to be a preacher, just look at Paul. Okay, and let that be your measuring guide and say, am I willing to face poverty? Am I willing to face hardships and beatings and catching every illness known to man, or even imprisonment to see the word of God continue to be spread? But in every circumstance, he'd learned to be content. In his imprisonments, he finds contentment. He finds it because he knows that God has brought him there for a purpose. He's not looking for a greater meaning to it. He's just saying, I know God is at work. Though all that we have to be thankful for, the pace and the pressures of life often squeeze the joy out of our lives. We may walk through life with our shoulders slumped down, our heads bowed, because we can't seem to find the joy throughout our days. We look at acquiring possessions, visiting places, seeing people, gathering with other people. But this book, Philippians, will remind us that the joy in the Christian life is all about perspective. Contentment and perspective are basically going to be used interchangeably here, because Paul knows that our contentment is based off of our perspective. We can end up in a situation and only look at the wrongs that have been done to us instead of looking forward to what God's going to do. And that's what Paul begins to put through here. He says that your contentment, your joy is found in your perspective of your situations. And he says the key to lasting contentment is found only through allowing our relationship with Jesus Christ to change our perspective. And that's not anything, as I was researching this, people were putting up, that's what cults try to do, is they try to brainwash you into seeing things in such a better way. And that's not what this is talking about. What we're talking about is for those that have engaged in a relationship, you're married, or you're engaged to be married, or you're in long-term relationships, you begin to see things differently because of your daily interactions with your loved one. So you may look at things completely differently, and we say that when we allow Jesus Christ into our lives, when we accept him in our lives, our perspective of things begins to change. Instead of seeing wrong, we see what God is doing. Instead of seeing pain, we see the end result. Instead of seeing our current circumstances, we look forward to what God is about to do. So it's not that we're just ignoring what's happening. Paul will go over that in a second. But I want to point that out, that our daily interactions with people begin to change our perspective. And Paul's not saying that you have to run everything through Jesus Christ and you'll see things differently. He's saying that your perspective on what's happening begins to change only because you see things through the eyes of Christ. So let's look at we're still in chapter 1 and verse 12. And this is how Paul starts this portion out. He says, "But I want you to know, brethren, that all things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel." So imagine his imprisonment, and he's kind of highlighting one of the conditions where he's imprisoned, and Paul and Silas begin to sing out praise and worship, and the doors fly open, and the guard that was standing at the opening of the gates is about to commit suicide because he knows that he's basically marked for death. Everyone, his only job, he had one job, and everybody escapes, but Paul runs in and he accepts Jesus Christ. And so Paul's basically underlining this situation because he knows that the man that he saved through that situation goes to the church in Philippians. So Paul, he answers a concern that the Philippian church has. He wanted them to know that God's blessing and powers were still with him, that Paul wasn't in sin because he was in prison. See, we tend to look at the things that go on in our lives, the bad things, and we say, am I no longer saved? Does God no longer love me? Do I still love God? And Paul is saying that just because we go through hardships does not mean that we have fallen out of grace of God, that we're in sin. It just means that there are times we're put through these conditions to see just what God can do. He wasn't out of the will of God, and God's work still continued. Through this period of imprisonment, through this period, Paul writes to Ephesians, he writes to Colossians, and he writes to the church in Philippians, all through this current imprisonment he's going through. The very foundations of Christian doctrine were solidified through some of the hardest times in Paul's life. See, though we can face hardships in our lives, God is always at work. What you see as an obstacle, God sees as an opportunity to solidify the foundations of your faith. When we're asking God where he's at during our troubles, he's always at work. Not just to sustain you through the trials, not just to barely get through these trials, but he's building a foundation on which you can grow. We're a foundation that you can touch and change the lives of others. Look, there's something that I recently read that said your life is under a microscope by non-believers. That they're looking to see if your faith, they're looking to see if this God is real by how you react to conditions they find you in. And Paul underlines that. He's saying, look, even though I go through this, I'm still holding strong to the faith. I'm still singing my songs of praise and worship. That I'm going through one of the roughest times in my life, and yet God is still at work. God didn't waste Paul's time during the Roman imprisonment. God never wastes our time. Though we may waste it by not sensing what God is doing, and by not sensing the purpose for our lives at that moment, we must know that God never wastes our time. He puts the furtherance of the gospel. Paul doesn't mention it as if he was being advanced. He didn't really care about his standings. He didn't really care how people saw him. He cared about how God saw him, what God was doing. He didn't care and he's also kind of assuming here the Philippians don't really care. So he's saying, I stand as an apostle. I'm imprisoned right now. But Paul knew that there were people that were looking at his life and were saying, like, okay, now's my time to rise above Paul. Now's my time to start going through these churches and become a prominent figure. So all Paul knows is that God is still on the move, and he's letting the church in Philippians know that. Look, how much more of an impact can a church make if there was no concern for advancement or acknowledgement? Not to see our personal agendas completed, not to see our personal opinions proliferated, but just to see the truth of the gospel spread. And Paul's telling them that here. He's saying, I don't care how much higher I get at this point. I don't care how people see me. They may see me and say, he's in prison. He can't do anything for his God, but he's moving it because his God is always at work. And Paul's kind of underlining there, how much more would the church advance together if nobody cared about who got recognition of what, of how much exposure we got in certain areas, but just to see the gospel spread. Then we look at verses 13 and 14. It says, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. The circumstances around Paul's imprisonment, he's making it clear to all the observers that he's not just another prisoner, but that he was a representative of Jesus Christ. So he's saying, I'm imprisoned because of my faith. He's not saying that I'm in prison because I broke a law. He's saying I'm imprisoned because I'm an emissary of Christ, because I represent Jesus Christ, because I'm preaching his name when they tell me not to. This witness led to the conversion of many. Even some of the palace guards that were watching him are converted over to Christianity because he holds to his faith in these horrible times. From this, we can see that Paul can minister effectively and bring glory to God in less than ideal circumstances. We're always waiting for the perfect circumstance. We're always saying, God, when you bring that person to me, God, when my life is just right, God, when I am in your blessings, I will begin to preach the word. I'll begin to spread. I'll sing your praises like no other. And God is saying our circumstances should not dictate our longing to reach others. And even in the worst of our circumstances, our holding to our faith speaks louder than any words you can ever think of. So you may think, God, what's the perfect thing I can say to someone? And you know what it turns into? It turns into, you know what? Live on fire for God yourself, because people will come to watch you burn. As we begin to shine for God, people will become drawn to the light. People will see this. But you know, we're going to go through these hardships. And through these hardships, God says it's important for us to burn ever brighter, because more people will come to watch. Those that see and are watching your life as you're going through these struggles will say, nothing shakes this person's faith. You have to see this. They're going through one of the hardest times I've ever witnessed. And look what's happening. And that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying our circumstances should not dictate our faith. It's saying our faith should grow ever stronger through these circumstances, because we know God is always at work and he never wastes our time. I like that Paul uses evident. That through these times in our lives, the work of God should be obvious. That's what he's saying. He's saying it should be ever evident that when we're in these times, our faith should shine even brighter. But he's saying it should be absolutely obvious that people say, how are you making it through this is only by whatever person you worship. Whatever deity you worship is the only reason you're getting through this, because they're watching. They're waiting for you to fail. They're waiting for that single crack to appear in that and say, see, I knew it wasn't real. It's all too easy for us to hide the light and joy of the Spirit of God when we're facing our troubles. But Paul says that as an emissary of Jesus Christ, that there are people watching to see God do something in your life. Look, there are those that can speak how much they detest religion. They can talk all they want, but let me tell you, they're watching your lives. They're watching how you're responding. And this doesn't mean that we need to fake that we're okay with our problems, but to truly depend on God to see us through these trials, knowing that He is always at work in our lives. We don't have to fake that we're okay. And I like that people will say that, like, well, everything goes right in your life. No. It's only because I trust God. It's only because I know that there is a work in my life. I know that there is a work in your lives that God says you don't have to worry about these trials, that yes, we're going to go through it. And no, sometimes we're not going to be okay as long as we depend on God to get us through this, as long as we know that God is always at work. Everything just seems to work out in our lives. Everything just seems to fit together even in the midst of our trials, only because we continue to follow the will of God. Through Paul's imprisonment, gave the Christians around him, even those that weren't in prison, greater confidence and boldness, because they knew that one of the greats, the GOAT basically of his time, the greatest of all time, not an actual GOAT, but of his time, he's sitting in chains and he's continuing to preach the gospel. And those that may fear, that may fear a harsh word from someone, those that may fear it are looking at their brother in chains and saying, if he can do it, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to be ever bolder to speak the word. And that's what these people begin to do. They saw that Paul had a joy in the midst of such a trial. They saw that God would take care of Paul in such circumstances. They saw that God could still use Paul even though he was imprisoned. That's the funny thing. People try, or in his time, the Romans were trying to contain this by imprisoning them. And what they were seeing was every time they imprison someone, the move gets even stronger. Every time they persecute a Christian, the move got ever stronger. And I mean, in their minds, it's supposed to go the opposite way. The more you imprison, the more you contain. But what we see is the more you try to contain, the more it gets uncontainable. The more it begins to grow, the more it begins to proliferate, because you're persecuting people for their faith. Then in verses 15 through 18, Paul, he begins to talk about some who, people that are going to be happy about his imprisonment, people that are going to try to advance themselves now that he's no longer basically on the preaching circuit. He's no longer available for like big events for churches. So some of these other guys, and he knows that's going to happen. And he's saying, I'm not envious of this, and my pride isn't going to get there. He says, because the gospel is still being preached. And then verses 19 through 20 say this, for I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectations and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always, so now also Jesus Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or death. See, Paul knew that the Lord was in control of all these events. He knew that. And he was trusting that. And even through his imprisonment, an impending trial before Caesar Nero made the situation look pretty dark. If you ever study who Nero is, put your safe search on when you're doing Google. A lot of stuff's going to come up just because of how the guy led a life of debauchery. But you'll see exactly how dark this emperor made the life of a Christian look. Paul was so confident because he knew that the Philippian church was praying for him. His deliverance in his present situation was connected directly to a church praying for him. See, I think in the church we need to learn something here. is that when we're suffering a personal trial, it's the church that reaches out to heaven. And like I've said before, that many hands going before God creates a bigger impact. That yes, our prayers, and we can reach out to an individual person, but I believe that the church is here for a purpose, and that purpose is to build each other up and to sanctify what's going on in our houses, to bring all of our prayers to God. And those prayers include people's issues. And when they say, I'm going through this, you know what? I'm not just going to keep it to myself, that I'm going to involve the entire church, that I'm going to let everybody that I come into contact know that I need their prayers, that I need their strength, and that I need them to lift my issues up to God and say that we are looking for a miracle. And Paul knows that. He says the Spirit is supplied through the prayers of the church. Paul can do it on his own. He can sit there and pray for himself and say, God, help me. But he knows that when there's a group of people that are in like mind, that are surrounding him in prayer, he knows that that is the true strength of a Christian, is when you have a group of people all unified in vision, all unified in prayers, praying for you. But it wasn't just the prayer of the Philippians itself that would meet Paul's need. He knows it's the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, and that came to Paul through their prayers. So he's saying it's your prayers that are bringing this, that are saturating my life in the Spirit of God, that are giving me this joy. It is your prayers. Paul's needs were met by the Spirit of God, but this provision to Paul was brought about by the support and the prayers of the local church. I like that he uses life and death. Imagine you get a letter from your pastor that basically says this, like, whether I'm alive or whether I'm dead, I'm doing this. Like, a lot of people would kind of freak out about this, and this must have hit this church a little bit harder because they love Paul, and they've been sending him resources, they've been sending him finances, they're doing everything they can to see his ministry continue to build. And here he's talking about life and death, and this must have hit him so hard that they wanted to see remarkable miracles of deliverance of Paul's life. It would have been easy for the Philippians to associate God's glory only with being delivered from one's problems. And that's what Paul's telling them, that God's glory is going to be lifted up, whether I'm delivered from this or not. He's telling them, if this circumstance takes my life, that does not change what God was doing. That does not change what you guys should be preaching. That does not change. Our affliction should not change how we speak about God, how we spread the name of Jesus Christ. It shouldn't change any of that. God can perform his miracles, but it's difficult for us to give our problems. We want to dictate how God is going to perform his miracles. That's kind of the humanity in us that says this. We want to pray for something, but we want to say, God, this is how you're going to do it. And we begin to box it in, and Paul's saying, widen your perspective and just give it to God and say, you're going to do something through this. Regardless of whether or not you remove this from my path, I know you're still at work, and you're not going to waste my time. You're not wasting your time, so I know you're working for my good. And then verses 21 and 22, it says, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is to gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet while I shall choose, I cannot tell. Paul's basically telling him he knew that death was not a defeat to a Christian. That if he faces the emperor and the emperor decides on execution, that's not going to be a defeat to him. It's merely a graduation into glory. This is also obviously showed that Paul didn't fear death. If Paul was martyred, his death would have caused an explosion of Christianity. He's barely in chains, and we start seeing the word spread. We start seeing churches proliferate. They start growing with Paul's imprisonment. Imagine what would happen if he's martyred for his faith. He walks up to there, gladly walking up, laying his head down, whatever method they would have found for his execution, walking up to it with a smile, knowing that he was moments away from being in the presence of Christ. He knew that that would cause an explosion of this faith. An absence of life on this earth is to be in the presence of God. And I've told this to people of faith when they're in a room and their family members, expecting to pass. It's a beautiful moment to be there because Jesus Christ appears in that room spiritually, and he's there to walk hand in hand with a true believer who passes from life into death. And just to be in that moment is a beautiful experience. A lot like birth. There's a lot of pain, we cry, but there's always joy to be found in it. But you're in a room where Jesus Christ himself enters, and picks this and walks their spirit into eternal glory. Paul saw his trials as a win-win. If I die, I'm in presence. If I die, Christianity is going to explode. I'm going to be in the presence of God. If I'm released, my strength and my faith will build others up, and we'll still continue to see this grow. 23 through 24 says, "For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you." That's kind of a weird statement. This almost sounds suicidal. Is Paul wanting to die? I mean, he puts down a desire to depart. This has nothing in common with the physical death. More, he's saying, I just want to be in the presence of God, where we're no longer in prison, where we're no longer persecuted for these things. We do it, and we know that persecution is spreading the faith, but man, I would love not to be persecuted and be in the presence of God. So he's not saying, I want to die. He's just saying that it would be far better for us not to be present on the earth, because absence from presence on the earth is presence in eternal glory. He's comforting the church that should his life end, joy is still to be found. Each one of us are going to have to face death. And he says how we face it is a testament of our faith. As we had basically a matriarch of our church pass, she met her maker with a smile on her face, probably ordering people around as she's walking in. But she walked into it holding strong to her faith and met her demise with a smile. She was expecting it. She knew it was going to happen. But that's what Paul's saying, that death is not an end, that there should be joy found in the passing, because absence on earth is presence in eternal glory. We're all going to have to face a physical death, but a physical death means to be present in heaven. But Paul knew and he understood that other people are still going to need him, that his work was not yet finished. So while allowing for the possibility of his martyrdom, of being executed, he tells the church that he expects to be spared at this time. And he does. It does happen. Paul survives this imprisonment, and he's set free, and later on he would visit the church, or revisit the church in Philippians. Now let's look at verses 25 and 26. "And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you for all your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again." And he's basically declaring that miracle. He's saying that I'm going to be freed from this, and then we're going to find joy, and I'm going to meet with you again. He's declaring all of this through his miracle, through his faith. And I think us Christians need to be a little bit more confident in our faith about that. That when we pray for things, yes, we can pray, God, do something, but then you know what? In our faith, we need to begin to speak what we believe is going to happen. Begin to speak what we know God is doing in our lives already. That I may be beaten down, I may be surrounded by an enemy, but Lord, I declare right now that you're going to free me from this affliction, and that I will continue to walk through these enemies, that all light will shine, darkness will run, and that I know that I will continue on the path that you have placed for my life, and that I will see this come to fruition. And Paul's saying that here. He's saying, I know it looks grim, but I know that I'm going to meet with you again, that I'm going to be in your physical presence, and that we're going to share in the joy of my freedom. Confident Christians know that the progress they find in life of faith in Jesus Christ is abundant in joy. No, we don't have to be happy we're suffering. No, we don't have to be okay with our suffering, but we have to know that God is at work, that his plan is unfolding before us, and it includes these trials to build the foundation of our faith that we can stand upon, and that he does not waste any of our time. So that's kind of the first chapter of Philippians that's in there. The whole book is basically, it's a happy note that Paul writes to this church, but he really does underline a lot of things that I believe we can still glean from it. So that's kind of chapter 1, letters from Paul. We're in the book of Philippians. I encourage you, continue to go back and read these. And let God speak to your life through these verses, because as we gain a further knowledge of what they are, a lot of times what we do is we just say, oh yeah, I heard Pastor Will talk about that, so I'm good to go. But you know what? Once you have an understanding, go back and reread it. Because God's gonna begin to expose things in your life. God's gonna begin to give you a deeper understanding of what these verses are saying to you personally. So I encourage you to go back and read it. I also encourage you to continue to support this ministry through your giving, your prayers, your support, your financial contributions can still be done via EasyTithe on your smartphone app. You can go to easytithe.com, search Praise Chapel Fresno, and it'll show you the one that you can give on. You can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click the menu button in the upper right-hand corner, go down to Give. It'll take you to a safe and secure website that you can give on. You can also go... You can mail in or drop off your financial contributions, your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts. If you don't know our address, you can Google Praise Chapel Fresno, California. It'll show your address. You can mail it in, drop it off, whatever you want to do. If you're joining us on our in-person services, we still have our tithes and offerings security box that you can drop those off in. It's emptied every Sunday to make sure that we go. We're still kind of doing it, trying to keep it as contactless as possible. So you can grab an offering envelope and then drop it off in there. We don't have the baskets going around and people walking down aisles and things like that. So still continue. If you're joining us on our in-person services, if you show up, we did announce when we started the live cast that we are not going to have our overflow room available. We're in a construction phase with that, with our Sunday school. To figure out what we're going to be doing there, you need to give us some time to be able to arrange and organize so we can get that properly done and get our kids in Sunday school and still reaching out to those that are at home, still live casting via Zoom. Our meeting's still going on. Times may change, but just keep an ear open for that, because we're going to be dropping that information, putting up on our website, as well as putting it on our social media. But if you're joining us in person, we'll see you here at the church 10 o'clock in the morning. We'll still be live casting. That'll probably never go away. Always live casting, spreading the word in any method that we can. God, Paul says in certain other portions of his letters, meet them where they're at. And some people are meeting us through social media. Some people are meeting us through YouTube. We're going to continue to meet you where you're at until you're comfortable joining us in the house of God and being joined together in his presence. But we'll see you guys 10 o'clock Sunday morning.